With how we feel in that space and our ability to be ready for engaging in that work, but also recognizing and uncovering and unpacking that our students come with a lot of knowledge already related to math and science that we just don't validate, don't see. When I was younger, I'd go to Mexico every year, and my dad would take me through the mountains, and he'd tell me what plants and what they would eat and how they would plant and what rocks they would use for different purposes. He was my first science teacher, frankly. So uncovering those pieces, those stories, those narratives is critically important. What does that look like in terms of when you're designing something in the classroom for our teachers? And how can we tap into that? How can we tap into that agency and those assets that students bring with them? And discourse. And I'm relating discourse, frankly, to agency. How does what we know connect to what we can do and say about it? What does it mean? How do we critically reflect? So it's not just STEM to learn, it's STEM with a critical purpose, and really trying to connect that. And again, this is built and builds upon our rubric, our observation rubric, because we can't do any of this without positive relationships with our students, so that ecology is foundational. We can't do any of this with a good design and task without student agency, but really thinking and looking at that identity piece, both within ourselves and who our students are, and what does that mean. So humanizing STEM is grounded in positionality, who we are in that space and time, in that critical conscious purpose, as well as valuing the community and cultural assets that our students come with. We enact it to really by thinking about humanizing pedagogy, by thinking about and enacting culturally relevant pedagogy, culturally responsive pedagogy. And we started thinking more concretely about what is a vehicle, because we have this theory, and our students are like, well, what does this look like? How can we do this in the classroom? How do we connect this to practice? So we started looking more closely at PBL as a vehicle, as a planning vehicle, to try to enact this work. So some of our teachers began to think critically about this and started engaging in lessons, one of them specifically around colorism and in a physiology unit, and in turn really having students value their melanin, their skin tone, but also introduce really unpacking the historical and frankly the racism and the colorism that's embedded in so many cultures and societies, and how that affects them today. But in the end, they were valuing their skin tone and really recognizing the assets of their skin tone. In elementary, this is when I was working, when the grant was K-12, frankly. And in elementary, some of our candidates focused in environmental justice and seeing of people of color in these movements and what that might mean for their neighborhood. The PBL, when do we do it? We do it normally at the end of their first year, their pre-service year. By then, they at least have some understanding, some tools of their context, expectations in general for planning, and they begin to design an integrated unit. And another big asset is that we pair our cohorts, so our math and science cohorts are paired together, so that allows for them to kind of inform each other and think about articulating across disciplines. What are the connections across disciplines? These are some of the examples. I'm not going to go through all of them, but with this work, a lot of them have tied to specific issues in the community, from toxic waste and chemistry and how they impact the community disproportionately, lead in water fountains that their own issues around climate change, environmental justice throughout the big issue is our students do something with this, right? Not just our students, the K-12 students. How are they going to make it public? How are they going to advocate? What is the action that's going to be taken given these topics? How can they communicate with their families and learn from their families around these issues? So some are school-based, very contextualized to their communities within the river. So a lot, if you'll notice, a lot on climate change and environmental justice. Some of them are more connected to the brain and the body, the issue, the concept of camouflage, and the analogy to how do we camouflage our way through life, and what does that mean? These real issues, how technology can get ahead of us, and how it's a tool, and how it's critically important that what are the choices that people are making, what are the regulations, what do we need to know, especially with genetic engineering. What access do we have in our communities to green space, to good food, and what are the limitations in terms of people having to work multiple jobs, and how buying organic is often a lot more expensive than going to the dollar menu at McDonald's. So bringing in those critical conversations into that classroom space and asking why. So dreams deferred, this one was a special topics, especially right now with COVID. Data, how can we use data to critically analyze the world around us, and what does that mean? And lastly, yeah, a lot on data. Oh, this one was really interesting. Valuing in this time of COVID, one of the teacher candidates actually cooked and asked their parents about the different foods and how they cook them, and the history and the storytelling and the narrative, and connected it to chemistry. So students created a cooking show in this time of COVID from all of the murals in LA, and how they connect to culture and the messages they send. I think that's it.
Hey, thank you, Imelda. All right, next we will hear from Jeff Scher. The screen is yours.
Great, thank you very much. Hello, good morning. Let me share. Okay, so basically, I teach in the teacher education program and also with undergrads, some courses on critical media literacy. And in our teacher ed program at UCLA, we've made this course a mandatory course for all our new candidates, whether they're science teachers or elementary teachers. Everybody takes it. And so I want to just talk about the course. I've put information in the resource Google Doc with the syllabus we have to the course. Actually, it's a really long syllabus with all the TPEs. Also an article that we wrote where we did some research about the course, the framework that I'll share with you, and also another handout. So let me get started. One of the things that I think is really important to look at today is that information is everywhere, and media is how we know about the world and interact with the world. Back in March, the United Nations Secretary General said, our common enemy is COVID-19, but our enemy is also an infodemic of misinformation. So not only are we subsumed with information, but we're also subsumed with misinformation and disinformation. And so these are all issues that we need to really prepare our students, and especially our new teachers, for how to engage their students with these ideas in terms of thinking critically and making sense of the world around them, because everything is mediated these days. So one of the things we try to do is redefine the term literacy. When we're talking about literacy, we're talking about reading and writing, but we need to expand it to go beyond what historically we've thought about as reading and writing, which has been just words on a page, right? Now we need to include in our instruction that literacy means being able to read and write images, sounds, advertising, social media, popular culture, as well as still words on a page. That's one piece. The other piece that we need to help students understand is that literacy needs to be deepened in terms of when we're talking about reading and writing. It's also about the ability to critically analyze the relationships between knowledge and power in society, understanding that it's never neutral, that information is always in some way benefiting or hurting somebody. So one of the big ideas about critical media literacy is that it's about a struggle to challenge dominant ideologies, white supremacy, sexism, heteronormativity, transphobia, all of these dominant ideas that are reproduced through media and through all the different institutions in our society are systemic issues. And what we want to do is we want to disrupt this idea of how often they pass as just normal and natural, to say, no, wait, these are constructions and it doesn't need to be this way. And furthermore, these are hurting a lot of people and shouldn't be these ways. So helping people recognize the bigger frames of ideological power structures is a key part of critical media literacy. Also want to just emphasize how this really does fit so nicely with the Common Core, because the Common Core says everything needs to be taught with literacy in every area, whether science, PE, it's all, literacy should run through everything, and we should be using technology, and we should be presenting with digital media in all sorts of different ways. So this isn't really anything additional on top of what they're already doing. This is really just deepening what they're supposed to be doing. This is the framework that we use. And like I said, this framework is in the Google Drive. And these, on the left, the conceptual understandings, that's the theoretical lenses that we use. These 6 big ideas that have evolved from a lot of different areas. And what we try to do is help the teachers understand the theory so that they can apply the questions. And whether they're teaching kindergarten or high school, it's the questions that we want them to engage their students with. Not the conceptual understandings as much as the questions as tools, because we hope that the questions, whether they're more critical questions, will guide the students to these more critical, deeper sense making of what it is, the information that they're reading and engaging and seeing and listening to, as well as the media that they're creating. So questions like, well, who created this? How did they create it? How could it be understood differently? What are different values and points of view? What's there, what's missing? Why was it created? And really one of the key questions, who does it benefit and who's being hurt by this messages? So I want to show just a few examples. There's a lot of websites out there. There's a lot of resources for this. It's just about finding them. And I'll share with you a link that we have at UCLA that lists a bunch of different articles, websites, and videos and lesson plans. This is one from FAIR where basically they looked at headlines from across the United States of the uprisings right now. And just looked at the way the headlines are being written, and especially focusing on the use of passive versus active voice. And what they did is they took a lot of headlines that had passive voice and they changed it into active voice. Instead of saying Floyd's death in custody draws condemnation for law enforcement, turning into active voice and say police killing of George Floyd draws this. And how our language really matters, and the power of language is an element of understanding that it's never neutral. Another thing to look at is different ways of doing this. And so what we've done is I've had my students use Google Slides, especially this last spring quarter, as a tool for creating media. And this was just one example. You know, with Google Slides, it's like a big PowerPoint that everyone has access to. So I had everyone take one slide and choose a piece of media that they've been seeing in their lives. So it's, by focusing on media, it gives you a chance to look at really deep personal issues that the students are choosing themselves. They're the ones saying, this is what I'm seeing on Instagram or Facebook or wherever it is that they're finding this, and then analyzing it. And so on the main section of the slide, they put the piece of media they found, and then below it, in the notes section, they wrote about their answers, responding, reflecting about the different media choices that they found. Another way of doing this is having them create media. So a really powerful part of analyzing is also production. You know, we read as well as write. So having them create, and for this assignment, again, using Google Slides, everyone was assigned a slide to put a meme. So to create their own meme related to something that they're feeling or experience related to the pandemic. So here are just a couple examples. One of the students created this, where doctors imagine you live when they say, if you have been exposed, stay at home and self-quarantine, right? Another example, this is a typical template for one of the memes, protection of health and safety of people, that way, save the economy, there goes the car, right? So these are just wonderful tools that we've been finding and using to encourage students to use the media as their vehicle to enter into asking and analyzing issues of racism, sexism, overconsumption, environmental degradation, all these different things that all connect. This was an example of students where they had to create different posters. And so on the Google Slides, I was able to put up the instructions as well as an example, as well as a rubric. And then they went and they added their posters that they created related to this. An example of using the camera. This is where students had to do selfies. And so one of the things I wanted them to think about is the way the different languages work, one of them being visual language. So visually using your own camera, photograph yourself to make yourself look really good, make yourself look really bad, and then we can analyze the whole concept of representation and how the images we see of certain groups and certain times typically are chosen and created and constructed in certain ways to position people to think and feel about those groups in certain ways. Also using pictures to teach other vocabulary and different issues using different types of media. So the final thing I'm going to wrap up right now is this guide that we have that I'll share the link in the chat, which has a lot of resources for, like I said, lesson plans and articles and all that stuff.
Thank you so much, Jeff. We appreciate what you've shared with us. And now I will turn it over to Diane.
So I wanted to share a conversation, part of a presentation that I had shared with educators in Oakland and on the topic of being an anti-racist educator. This conversation was with mainly teachers and central office staff. So that's what you see here. My name is Diane Lang, and I'm a field supervisor at UC Berkeley, part of the BE3 program. So some of the things that we were talking about as far as our information to educators are some of the things that they should have known, because there was an ask, or should have known, but there was an ask to go beyond kind of the general racism and white supremacy 101. So we were talking about some of the things that we had covered. So that's what you see on this slide where it says assumptions. Basically, it was an explanation that the things you see on the left, such as white supremacy culture, the racist policies that exist within the school district, racist procedures, the ongoing racist practices, the use of tone policing, particularly for students of color and staff of color. If nothing else, if there's no other problem, then so often we will hear, well, I just didn't like the tone that the person was using as a complaint against them. Racial stereotypes, tokenism, as we always say, we'd like to have more people and staff of color, teachers of color, and then listening to their experiences. The tokenism is happening, saviorism, and then white centering. These were some of the acknowledgements of racism and the ideology of white supremacy. The objectives were being able to acknowledge racist and anti-racist educational policies and having a discussion around how colonialism has impacted the development of our current system and our classrooms in Oakland. Being willing to make a personal commitment to improve our own critical awareness to disrupt the racism that we are all complicit in perpetuating, and then being willing to talk about race and racism with students and colleagues. This slide shows the there it is, has the framework that we discussed, and this was taken from Dina Simmons on an article on how to be an anti-racist educator. But the main points that I wanted to share with you are here. An agreement, an ask, an invitation to engage in vigilant self-awareness, acknowledging racism and the ideology of white supremacy, studying and teaching representative history. So think, ethnic studies as the core coursework, not an elective. talking about race with students. And then ultimately the ask is, when you see racism, committing to do something about it. I wanted to hold space to talk about what are some of the ways that racism and colonization are operating within your sphere of influence. So I gave time to educators, central office folks to think about this. And you see the circle in the bottom left, engaging in vigilant self-awareness. So asking people to think about, how do we perpetuate racism and colonization? And so on the yellow slides here, or yellow Post-it notes, you're seeing some of those things. And you can read those. I'll just give you a moment, but this is basically some of the ways to help people get their ideas flowing around what we perpetuate in our schools in Oakland. I wanted to cover tools for decolonizing the classroom. And so just a few, you see the 3 circles, and that's kind of the through line for this conversation, going back to that slide about anti-racism in our schools. And so asking whose narrative is missing from the conversation, and giving participants time to reflect on the need for multiple narratives. And that need and that ask for multiple narratives is part of what the curriculum, when we talk about teaching representative history, that's one of the reasons why, so that we are presenting multiple narratives. Approaching students and their families from a strength lens. So asking, what are our students' strengths, not challenges, and how am I speaking about my students and their families and colleagues? And then finally, acknowledging patterns of power that focus on Eurocentrism, for example, European standards of beauty, and you can read the rest there. I want to be considerate about the time, so I'll keep going. This is a quote that we shared about our practices. In this country, American means white. Everyone else needs to hyphenate, bringing in the voice of Toni Morrison. And then basically just a belief about our children in school and really everywhere. Every child deserves an education that guarantees the safety to learn in the comfort of one's own skin. Again, bringing in the voice of Dina Simmons, whose framework we used for this session. And then the optimistic closure, something that I do in my work in Oakland, we use this close. The ask of participants is to speak up. What is one thing you want to speak up about? So I give participants time to really think after going through the information. Think about a shift. What is a shift in mindset that you may need to work towards in your classroom? And then ultimately take action. What is one tool, practice, or strategy you want to implement in order to take action next week? So those were that's a very brief, condensed version of some of the work I have been doing with teachers, principals, new educators as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diane. And now we're going to hear from Neves.
Good morning, folks. My name is Neves Wetzel de Cediel, and I'm the Director of Field Supervision for UC Berkeley's BE3 program, and that's Berkeley Educators for Equity and Excellence. And I teach in the program, and I also teach in the Principals Leadership Institute program, and we have a lot of shared work around anti-racism that we engage together across those 2 professional programs. What I wanted to share with you is actually to give just a snapshot of some of the actual practices that we use across student teaching as well as supervisor PD, and also where instructors and co-directors all together are receiving ongoing training. So work and training that's interstitial to required coursework to ensure that all stakeholders are sitting in dialogue together using particular protocols. So just wanted to give you a window into actually what I've inserted into the folder as tools, and I've included the types of prompts we use in those individual slides. But for example, before the launch of the Identity, Race, and Racism, it's 2 full days that we'll be doing in December. Here's an example of the guiding question. So How might employing discomfort as a pedagogy puncture the dominance of white supremacy in teacher education? So even though this won't happen until December, when students were being oriented back in June, and then also for our supervisory team and in our own ongoing PD, the expectation is you're supposed to feel uncomfortable all the time at different levels based on how you're entering into a dialogue of what it means to be a responsible, professional, edified, humanized, anti-racist teacher, supervisor. The mode is an intentional application of a pedagogy of discomfort. So the idea of cognitive disequilibrium is our norm. You should always feel a little off center. And as you get off center, you are in a collective dialogue and action to work through that and move to that next place you need to grow. So objectives, for example, talk about and interrogate through reflection and dialogue your current understanding of the United States continuum of state-sanctioned racial violence. So what my colleagues who preceded me in this session have already pointed out is the content and the tools we offer students. Those tools are the richest, most context-laden pieces of material we can offer students to begin exploring. How do you teach across all these modalities and subject matter? But a tool is a tool, but if the hand doesn't know how to wield the tool won't work. And so starting at a place that we expect folks to come in ready and willing to engage in self-interrogation so that as we hand them these tools, as my colleagues have laid out, they not only know what to do with them, they want to work with them. They want to, they have a want. And so we refer to that as will. The will to be an anti-racist, the will to think about equity in your bones. It's a visceral process, and it comes from a place of us supporting our students and each other meaning I'm always referring to staff, supervisors, faculty, and we have to be looking at ourselves as we also look outward in how we serve each other and support each other in the university, in our broader communities as we serve students in schools and their families. So for example, what I've given here is I have 3 different sources of that I put in the folder, and I'm gonna just pop through each one of them. These are the exact same resources supervisors in their PD and also student teachers are using. So one is an article called Avoiding Racial Equity Detours by Paul Gorsky. And so I put this quote here for your own consideration, and you know, if the spirit so moves you, throw a comment, connection, or question into the chat. But I'll read it for you. The hard truth is that racial equity cannot be achieved with an obsessive commitment to meeting people where they are, when where they are is fraught with racial bias and privilege. That would be a journal, a think time piece that we would begin and open a PD with, we will open with, and then we begin a dialogue. And remember, that dialogue is framed in very specific agreements and conditions. We use Courageous Conversations About Race, the work of Glenn Singleton, but avoiding racial equity detours. So that is a short article I'm offering you that really gives some very pointed argument for what those racial equity detours are when we look at policy in schools, both K-12 and on the university side. And then how do we pivot and activate if we're already in a mode of we are equity minded and we are anti-racist by identity, not practice, by identity, then practice. Where can we seek out alliance and camaraderie to push against these systems that are really entrenched? They're very, very rooted. Those taproots run deep. So it's gonna take a lot of work to dislodge them. But again, there's an obsessive commitment to meeting people where they are. Or I've heard the phrase that worries me to death is, how do I keep people in the room? And so the next thing, I'm gonna do some self-disclosure and what that looks like when I myself uphold whiteness to keep people in the room. So slide 2 connects to Gorsky's racial equity detour and the definition, because definitions are important. Equity, even in this space that we're all sharing, to make sure that we all know what the other is talking about. So over-explaining sometimes because all of us are not holding the same information. So I wanted to make sure Gorsky's meaning of racial equity detour, the detours people take to protect their privilege and avoid the work of racial justice. It's amazing the gymnastics people will do to keep privilege in place. We've all seen it. Sometimes it'll make your mouth drop open because it is allowed to stand. It's allowed to prevail. 2 questions that supervisors, instructors, student teachers will grapple with. Do you think your school district and or program engages in equity detours? Explain. So these are things that I want to offer you as questions if you find use in the tools I humbly offer to you. So Gorsky's article is a 2019 article. The next source I'm going to show you, Gorsky relies heavily on the work of Joan Olson, which is an older work, but one that is so relevant and useful right now. That is called Detour Spotting. And that is a work from 1997. And what Joan Olson did is she outlined 18 detours. And she is a white pedagogue and a researcher who is addressing her writing to white folks. But what we have learned in the use of her work is where us as folks of color, and when I say us, anybody who identifies as folks of color, how when we in the university setting or when we in our roles, also because of our internalized oppression, my internalized oppression, I also uphold some of these detours. So I said I'm going to reveal to you where I uphold whiteness and keep it in place to protect myself. I make choices when I stand in front of a group to use certain words because I know there may be some of my audience who I will insult and anger so deeply that they will in turn do something, meaning not invite me to a meeting, not allow me to take part in something that is part of my job to do, make it difficult for me to speak and share an idea because they have a pushback. And what I do sometimes is once I've seen that pattern played out, I uphold that whiteness that they're exerting on me by also me downplaying my message. And it is something that is a sickening relationship that goes on at the university level. I'm not talking about student teachers anymore. But if we have that interplay within us as professional colleagues, there is no mystery as to why some of our students, based on what colleagues have shared all morning and yesterday, would be feeling unseen, shut down, disregarded, and disrespected, because we're all impacted by global oppression and racism. So there's no reason why the institution should not count itself in being influenced by nefarious forces. So I just pulled out 5 of Olson's detours. I started with I'm colorblind. So why are you talking to me about race again? And then I ended it with silence. Silence I knew is the one that so many people can relate to immediately. And this morning, when Rita showed the video of teacher Joemi going to her principal to talk about, I need some support to do this work, she was met with silence. Silence sometimes is words. We can say words that are actually silent. Well, that's your choice, Joemi. If you're not happy here, leave. So silence is also something that is heartbreaking. It also touches on the mental health impact of being told over and over, being blockaded. And so those are those detours that some of us actively are taking and might not even be really hyper aware. So when you go into the detour spotting tool, if you choose to, Olson really talks about these levels of awareness is not enough. What you gonna do? What's the next step? Because we all know how to read and write and think, but it's about doing. So again, here's a definition I pulled together from Olson. To consciously interrogate one's own racist attitudes and their attached behaviors. Then take responsibility for the consequences of those behaviors. Then determine a plan to excise those attitudes and behaviors and retool or replace with new anti-racist attitudes and behaviors. We do this as a collective. This work cannot be done in isolation, belly button gazing. I have to get real, I have to get checked, I have to over and over and over and over again. It's an exercise for the rest of my life. And so that's what we are conveying to student teachers. You don't have a class on diversity or a class on anti-racism and you got it. Then it's like, you have to make a decision. Is this my identity or is it something I put on when I go in a classroom? And finally, characteristics of an anti-racist leader. This tool is something that's pulled from Glenn Singleton's work from Courageous Conversations About Race. And this, this list is a list of phrasing, internal dialogue that one would have with oneself about how do I hold this in my body, me as a practitioner, but me in my life. Me with my family, me with my community, me with my parents. But here's a question for your consideration. What does it mean to me personally to be an anti-racist leader, teacher, and or supervisor? That is core to the BE3 UC Berkeley program. Start with the self, concurrently with learning about the local and the global around you. I'm just gonna click on the link really quick so you can let your eye catch a couple of these statements. As an anti-racist leader, I do things outside what is seen as normal. People often get mad at me or disagree with me. Some of you are already nodding your heads. I'm constructivist. I ask questions. I build on what I know about the current, existing, and known places where people are. I'm gonna go down. Item 10, I learn from kids. I respond to kids. I seek out ways to stay informed and feel the feelings students of color have as they experience school. 8, I can be future focused because I realize where I've come from. My own personal inquiry helps me stay grounded and future focused. So just to share with you today, and thank you for your time and attention, I cannot talk about equity and anti-racism somewhere else if I'm not always talking about it for myself with my closer community. I'm really happy to have been able to be here with my colleagues and hear what you all had to say beforehand, because I'm just seeing these threads that if we can collaborate across programs, there's more power in numbers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nevis. And to all of you, to Imelda, to Jeff, to Diane, we appreciate everything that you all have shared today. It's been very rich what you've shared, much to think on. I wish that we could extend this time for questions and dialogue, because it's so much that you all have presented. I really wish there was a part 2 to this, but unfortunately it's not. All right, take care.
Thank you.